Week 1 is here and you need to figure out who to start in your fantasy football league. And my goodness, there are so many wide receivers that you can choose from. So in this video, we're going to rank the top 40 for you so you know exactly who to be starting for week 1. And we'll start with some of my tier 1 players here. We're breaking these down by tiers. I'm not going to do this for every tier, show you them all right away, but for tier 1, it's kind of some obvious names here. My rankings are Tyreek, Amon-Ra, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, and Ja'Marr Chase. Those 5 receivers in that order. Now let's break it down. Look, the reason I like Tyreek Hill is a couple of things. First off, he's going to face the Jaguars at home. This game has a 49-point team total according to DraftKings, and this Jaguars secondary is not good. Last year, it was the 29th ranked secondary in the NFL. If we go over to PFF here, you can see they brought in some names. They bring in a Darnell Savage, a former Green Bay Packer, a Ronald Darby. They take some players in the draft, to Jerry and Jones, but it's still a unit that was, again, bottom 5 last year in the entire NFL, and now they're getting a lot of new pieces in. We'll see how it works. It's probably not all going to come together week 1. And not to mention, Tyreek Hill's a target hog in himself, and Jalen Waddle's been battling an injury, although he's returned to practice, so he might not be 100%. Odell is not going to be with the team for the first at least 4 weeks of the season, so it might just be the Tyreek show like we saw last year a lot of the time, earning a 30% target share. Now, if I go back to these rankings, I have Amon-Ra St. Brown, the number 2 wide receiver for this week, and honestly, he was really close to being my number 1 receiver because his matchup is that good. Because Amon-Ra is going to go up against the Los Angeles Rams. First off, this game has a 51-point total, the highest on the week, so this is the best fantasy environment, and the Rams defense in general has question marks along the defensive line because Aaron Donald's no longer there, and in their secondary right now, they're starting Tre'Davious White, who hasn't been the same since his injury, and Darius Williams they're bringing back, who's a decent cornerback, but those are their best guys. That's a little bit of a concern. It's probably a bottom 10 to even bottom 5 secondary, and last year against bottom 10 secondaries, Amon-Ra averaged 119 yards per game. All right, now my wide receiver 3 was Justin Jefferson, and just to break it down a little bit, look, he's going up against potentially the second worst secondary in the NFL this year in the New York Giants. The biggest question here is, will Sam Darnold, the Vikings' new starting quarterback, have time to throw against a really good Giants pass rush? It's probably the bright spot of their team, because if he does, Jefferson should have a good game. And even if Darnold struggles, he's probably just going to throw it, to the best receiver in the NFL at least 10 to 12 times. I mean, even more potentially, because Jordan Addison's dealing with a leg injury. He's not going to be 100% week 1. They don't have TJ Hawkinson, their tight end, until maybe even November if we go down to the tight end position. There you are, according to Player Profiler. So honestly, there's not much playmakers here in the passing attack. The run game with Aaron Jones and Ty Chandler has a tough matchup against the Giants defensive line. I think they're just going to focus on Jefferson. He's top 3 this week. My number 4 receiver was CeeDee Lamb, who recently signed his massive deal, and honestly, this week it's not a great matchup for him. Lamb's going to face a Brown secondary that is definitely among the league's best secondaries. They have guys like Denzel Ward on the outside. Greg Newsome will be in the slot if Lamb ends up moving into the slot. This is one of the better secondaries in the entire NFL. It's a difficult matchup for Lamb, but here's the deal. It's difficult to get too concerned about CeeDee because he's just going to do what he did last year when he had 170 targets, when he had a massive year of 1,700 yards because he had no competition, and he has that exact same competition this season, and Brandon Ayuk, who's another year older, like 32 years old. Jalen Tolbert, who's getting some hype or was getting some hype in training camp, but for the most part, we know what he is as a 3rd option in this offense, maybe even a 4th option behind the tight end Jake Ferguson, who wasn't all that efficient when he got more usage last year, just kind of a red zone target. So you're going to get 8 targets minimum out of CeeDee Lamb. Even in a difficult matchup, we know the offense is going through him. He's top 5. And number 5 here is Ja'Marr Chase, who, as I record this, is still trying to work out his contract situation. I mean, I could actually pull up a tweet here that's maybe a little bit concerning for some of you. Head coach Zach Taylor said Ja'Marr Chase status for week 1. We'll just take it day by day. Now, ideally, by the time that you're watching this video, he's already signed his contract. It's later in the week, and we're all good to go. But I just want to point that out, that maybe there's a chance that he doesn't, although I believe he will, but we'll see. Now, assuming that he does sign that contract, they're big favorites, 8.5-point favorites, which means they might not have to throw as much in the second half of this game. Only a 40-point total against the Patriots, who are not expecting to put up much of a fight here. They do have an exciting cornerback, the New England Patriots, Christian Gonzalez, who played in 4 games as a rookie last year and looked good, but then got hurt. So now there's some question marks about him coming back from an injury. Ja'Marr Chase himself might move into the slot more with Tyler Boyd gone. So I think Chase will be fine in this spot. You're obviously starting. Now I have to come clean because I actually have one more wide receiver in my first tier, and it's this man right here, my wide receiver 6 on the week. It's AJ Brown closing up tier 1 for us because look, this 3-time Pro Bowler is going to have actually a pretty solid matchup in my opinion against the Green Bay Packers, who do have a strong secondary. It could be one of the best by the end of the season. And we know that they have a shutdown cornerback in Jair Alexander, who, although the last 2 seasons he's battled injuries, he has been solid when out there. But here's the deal about Jair Alexander. He's just 5'10", 196 pounds. AJ Brown's going to have 30-plus pounds and like 4 inches of height on him. So there's going to be a massive advantage when they're matched up together. But the new offense with Kellen Moore as the play caller is probably going to rotate and motion AJ Brown around, which we really haven't seen yet in this Eagles offense much, meaning he'll actually get the most beneficial matchup a lot of the times. And that's what I'm really excited to see in this Kellen Moore offense, is how much he ends up changing the offense and puts more deception, goes out of shotgun more, uses motion more, and that's going to help everybody on the offense, including your alpha receiver who's just been dominating for 150 target seasons the last 2 years in Philadelphia. I'm expecting another big year this season and another big one, week 1 matchup against the Packers for A.J. Brown, so that's why he's a tier 1 receiver. Heading into tier 2, we get Mr. Reliable, Mike Evans, the number 1 receiver for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's had 1,000+ yards every single year of his career for 10 seasons, which is just absolutely insane, but there are some moving pieces this offseason. His play caller, Dave Canales, that led to maybe a season career high year last year for one Mike Evans. Dave Canales is now gone. Now that might end up being a concern at some point this season for Evans as he ages and maybe Chris Godwin gets more involved in a better role in this offense, but for week 1, it shouldn't be an issue against the Commanders. The Bucs are at home. They're favorites. They have a decent team total in this one, and the Washington Commanders do not have a good secondary. They lost big pieces like Kendall Fuller, their biggest piece in the secondary this offseason, and really didn't replace it. According to PFF, this is the 30th ranked secondary entering the NFL. Check that, not entering the NFL, entering the 2024 season. Apologies. Now we know the competition that Evans is going to have. Honestly, I do think Chris Godwin, who saw just as many targets as Evans last year, right around 130 or so, I think he'll have a better role in this offense. We'll talk about him more later though. But outside of that, they bring in a 3rd-round rookie that some people are excited about out of Washington in Jalen McMillan. I think he's a decent player, but he's not somebody that's going to threaten right away for taking a massive target share away from one Mike Evans. And I will pull this up from my friend Matt Harmon that we do shows together. You can check it out on Yahoo every single Wednesday morning. Our podcast and YouTube show comes out over there. You can see right here, Mike Evans' success rate by year, 73 success rate versus man coverage last year, career best. So he was coming off of a career best season, and he dominates man coverage. And the good thing is this week against Washington, he's facing Dan Quinn, their head coach now, loves to play man coverage. This should be a good matchup for Mike Evans. My wide receiver 8 is Puka Nacua. He's top 10 for me in his Sunday night matchup against the Detroit Lions. But honestly, this Detroit Lions defense, we're going to talk about it, especially the secondary. They made some upgrades this offseason, paired with a solid pass rush. It could be a good unit. Now, Puka Nacua, we know what he did last year as a rookie. He's still just 23 years old. He had a little bit of a knee issue, a bursa sack they call it, but he should be good to go. He's been practicing in camp. He's entering year 2. It should only get better for this guy in an offense that, as long as Matthew Stafford is healthy, which he is entering the season, and the offensive line is trying to get healthy for week 1, if it does, it should be good enough to hold up against the Detroit defensive line. But as I mentioned, the Lions did add to their secondary. A unit that was really poor last year started to come on towards the end of the year, but Carlton Davis they had from Tampa. They had Amik Robertson, but more importantly, Terrion Arnold is a guy that literally during the NFL draft process was interviewed, and he said, yeah, if my own mother or mother-in-law was across from me, I would stiff her into the dirt in terms of just guarding somebody. So yeah, this dude is legit. He's a talented player. They added pieces to their secondary is the point. Now, I do think Puka Nacua will see a lot of Carlton Davis, the newcomer to this program, and he ends up going in or coming from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where last year, overall, he's a solid cornerback, but last year he had a career worst year, so he kind of has to get back on the horse this season, and it's going to be a tough matchup for him to do so against Puka Nacua in week 1. We remain in tier 2 with my wide receiver 9, and that's going to be Garrett Wilson, who, look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you. He has a brutal matchup against a defense in the 49ers that was a top 5 pass defense last year, and on paper entering this year, PFF has them as the number 2 unit in the NFL. This is a primetime Monday night game. It has just a 43-point total. The Jets are 4.5-point underdogs on the road. They're not projected to score a lot of points. Aaron Rodgers is coming off of a torn Achilles, so there's a lot of question marks here, but the good news is it'll be a much improved offensive line for the Jets, and we know that the offense is going to filter through Garrett Wilson when there's not many other options outside of, Mike Williams, a rookie Malachi Corley. There's not many other options to be throwing to, so top 10 receiver this week is Wilson despite the difficult matchup. Rounding out my top 10 is another Miami wide receiver, and that is going to be Jalen Waddle. I talked about how good this matchup was earlier when we were talking about this guy, our number 1 overall receiver right here, and Tyreek Hill against the Jaguars secondary that even though they added a bunch of safeties and some younger players and some free agents that a lot of other people really didn't want, it's still going to be a question mark to how this unit comes together week 1. Now, as for Waddle, even considering last year that he had a down year and he was banged up, he only played in 14 games, this is still a guy that went out there and had 72 yards per game in this offense because it's a high-flying offense, because there's a lot of attention on one Tyreek Hill. This was still a guy that, again, despite missing 3 games, put up over 1,000 yards for the 3rd straight year, every single year of his NFL career. He's gone over 1,000, as you can see, last year. But here's the thing with Jalen Waddle. We do want to track his injury status because he's been banged up. He did partake in practice last week towards the end of the week, so that's good news with an undisclosed injury, but just keep an eye on that while he practices this week. Now, before we get into the next tier of wide receivers, and we're really going to start to get to those flex options, which can help you win leagues, I got to ask you a question. Do you want to win your fantasy league up here? Well, if so, click this button right here, and if it sounds like you, well, look at this. You can get my risk-free fantasy blueprint. It's basically like my draft kit during the season, in season. You can get it risk-free through one of our 2 partners. Now, what does all this mean? Well, during the season, I'll send you a tool every single day. Waiver wire tiers and priorities, rankings and projections, matchup notes, rest of season rankings for trades, and a whole lot more. That's what's in this blueprint. And it's absolutely risk-free when you sign up through one of our 2 partners. It's just $10 for the entire year when you deposit through them. There'll be steps on this page linked down below. And if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, look at this. I 100% refund that $10. No questions asked. You get it it right back. Over 15,000 people are currently using the blueprint. People in your league might be using it. They probably are, so you should too, just to keep up with them. You can scan the QR code on the screen right here or click the link in the description below to get access risk-free through one of our 2 partners. And I most definitely have to let you know that one of those 2 partners is Underdog. And here's the thing. They're giving out a bunch of free picks this week. They have a free Travis Kelce pick for Thursday, depending on when you're watching this. Friday night's game, there's going to be one for a certain quarterback on the Philadelphia Eagles in that game is what I hear. And then Sunday, there'll be a free Dak Prescott pick. Now, what does all this stuff mean? It means that it's literally free. They'll be at a half a passing yard. You win the bet. You just win the bet. It's as simple as that. They want you on their platform. It's a big week 1 for promotions. So they'll just let you do it. But you can just win that bet and then take it out if you want to. As I mentioned, they're one of our fantasy blueprint partners that you can find with that QR code or link down below. So not only will you get the blueprint when you sign up and deposit, remember with code SAL, you also go get all those free picks for week 1. Take advantage of this. Not now, but right now. We remain in tier 2 with my wide receiver 11, and that is Cooper Kupp. And here's the deal. Look, Cooper Kupp is finally healthy entering a season for the first time in 2 years. And now he faces a Lions team that struggled to defend slot cornerbacks last year, ranking 10th worst in the entire NFL. Now, of course, they have some new personnel, so that can change, but that's important to point out as they do have some of the same secondary pieces. Now, look, we're probably never going to get the historic 2021 season that we got from Cooper Kupp when he went for 1,900 yards on 145 catches. He's older. He's dealt with multiple injuries. Puka Nacua is now there, but this guy's finally healthy. And last year when he was healthy in 12 games, if you look at just his completed games, he averaged 8.5 targets per game, put up similar points to Puka Nacua, and was a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy production. That's somebody that I want to be starting for sure this week. All right, now we're finishing up tier 2 with my wide receiver 12, and that's Amari Cooper, who's playing his old team, the Dallas Cowboys. This should be a close game. It's about a 2-point spread, and I think Amari Cooper sneaky, quietly has a great matchup because he faces the Dallas Cowboys, like I said, his former team, who ranked 13th entering the season in their secondary play according to PFF, but since then they lost free agent Stephon Gilmore. They lost Deron Bland as well, who is injured. So this is a unit that has Trevion Diggs, who we all kind of know what he is, a playmaker. He'll take a lot of risks. He'll get burnt a lot. There's not a lot of secondary pieces here in terms of cornerback talent that I'm worried about going up against Amari Cooper. He's great. And the rumors are that this team wants to throw the ball more. New offensive coordinator Ken Dorsey is a piece of that, especially since they can't lean on Nick Chubb and they're trying to go through life without Nick Chubb on this Cleveland team now. They want to throw the ball more with Deshaun Watson, the guy that gave a bunch of guaranteed money to. He'll be behind a top 5 offensive line in a quality matchup for Amari Cooper. We like this. He's a top 12 option. We kick off tier 3 with my wide receiver 13, a guy I was very high on, took him in the second round of a couple of my fantasy drafts this offseason, and that's Drake London, who has a nice matchup in week 1 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And here's the deal. Obviously, now he gets a great quarterback situation. Kirk Cousins, who last year was highly efficient, top 5 in passer rating, number 1 in passing yards per game before suffering his Achilles injury. I mean, this is a guy who had 2,300 yards, 18 touchdowns, and only 5 interceptions, and the dude was like barely halfway through the season before suffering that injury. And here's the thing. My friend Matt Harmon, that I do shows with over on Yahoo, you can see one on the screen right now that we did last week, he was telling me how Kirk Cousins last year was 2nd in passer rating against man coverage. Now he faces a defense in Pittsburgh that likes to run man coverage. So we got Drake London in like the worst case situation last year with Desmond Ridder and these awful quarterbacks going for over 900 yards and 69 catches. Yeah, now you're actually getting a quality quarterback, assuming the the Achilles is fine, behind a good offensive line. We're in on Drake London. My wide receiver 14, it's time to talk rookies. The first rookie taken in the NFL draft with a top 5 pick, Marvin Harrison of the Arizona Cardinals. But here's the deal. He's going to have a really difficult matchup this week to kick off his NFL career. Because boy, oh boy, he's going to have to face the Buffalo Bills, who despite having so many moving pieces in their secondary, right? They lose Jordan Poyer. We don't know what the health status of Micah Hyde will be to start the season. These safeties that we've been relying on, despite all of that, they still have quality cornerback play. They still have quality depth back there. I'm not really too concerned about this secondary. Neither is PFF ranking them as a top 3 unit. So that's not great for Marvin Harrison Jr. But the Cardinals are 6.5-point underdogs, as you can see right here on DraftKings, which means that they're going to be trailing in this game, probably have to throw more than usual. At least that's what the expectation is. So if they're going to throw more than usual, and instead of Kyler throwing 32 times, he pushes towards 40 pass attempts, that could be a game right away when Harrison is pushing towards a 10+ target contest. We like that. Wide receiver 15, as we're still in tier 3, is Deebo Samuel for me. And yes, I do have him ranked ahead of Brandon Ayuk this week. Kill me, whatever you want to say here, but he's facing a very difficult matchup in the New York Jets. But here's the thing. The New York Jets have the number 1 ranked secondary in the NFL, according to PFF, entering the season, and probably anybody with a set of eyes that knows this defense, Sauce Gardner, the talent they have. This unit is no joke. Talent everywhere. But here's the deal when you're talking about Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel is a matchup nightmare. Like, nobody really can guard him. It's not going to be one-on-one. He's going to be put in motion, used in the backfield, used in weird ways, short catches after the catch. So really the matchup doesn't matter as much for him as it will for a guy like Brandon Ayuk. My wide receiver 16 is another rookie, Malik Neighbors, who I think he has a really nice matchup starting the season off against the New York Giants. Now, I am a little bit concerned about Daniel Jones in this offensive line against the Minnesota defense. Maybe it could all go to just crap here. But this is a game that should remain close. DraftKings has it as a 1-point spread. The Giants are home favorites. And as long as Daniel Jones, and this is the biggest thing here, as long as this guy has some time to throw on some plays, you're probably going to see like a 28 to 35% target share. Translation, like 7 to 10+ targets for Malik Neighbors. And that's really, really good against this secondary. because this Vikings secondary ranks 27th entering the NFL season, and honestly, it might be worse than this because they've just dealt with a lot of things. They lost a cornerback on the first day of camp with an ACL. On the second day of camp, they had Shaq Griffin ended up pulling his hamstring. They cut a 2022 first-round pick cornerback Lewis Cine, and then they lost Kyrie Jackson this past offseason, unfortunately in a tragic car accident. So they've just had a tough offseason in general. I mean, simply put, this Minnesota secondary just needs more time and resources. It's as simple as that, but they don't have it because now they have to face Malik Nabers in week 1. Week 1 is indeed here, and they're just not really well suited at this point, and they're going to have to face this dude who put up over 1,500 yards last year at LSU, 89 catches, is extremely dynamic, explosive after the catch and on his routes. I like Malik Nabers in week 1. I've taken him for over 55.5 receiving yards already. We're all in. All right, now we go to my wide receiver 17, and it's Nico Collins, who is going to have a solid matchup against the Colts. Like, they do have talented defensive backs. Kenny Moore is one of the best slot cornerbacks in the NFL, but lucky for Nico Collins, he doesn't go in the slot a lot. That's not going to be his role in this team. He's going to dominate on the outside for CJ Stroud. And oh yeah, Nico Collins dominated the Colts last year. In 2 games, he averaged 171 receiving yards in 1 touchdown. A monster. We've talked a lot this offseason about the new addition in Stefon Diggs and what Tank Dell's role will look like for this week, and I think this is going to be really important. I think to start the season, Stefon Diggs will be in 2 wide receiver sets. Tank Dell will rotate in 3 wide receiver sets, but the guy that's never going to be leaving the field based on preseason usage and just some usage last year is going to be Nico Collins, a strong start, a top 20 option. Now this takes me to my wide receiver 18. You can see in Davante Adams, look, I'm not really too interested in this matchup this week. It's going to be his team, the Raiders, who we know want to be run heavy. Will probably use a lot of 2 tight end sets under head coach Antonio Pierce versus the Chargers, who we know want to be run heavy under Jim Harbaugh. Like, this is a game where the Chargers are 3-point favorites, so maybe the Raiders throw a little bit more since they're underdogs, but this game has just a 40-point total. We know there's not going to be a lot of points, a lot of plays. Both teams are going to run at a slow pace in this one, but the good news for Davante Adams is as long as the Raiders can throw like 25 to 30 times, look, this dude averaged 10 targets per game, second most in the NFL, a 33% target share. As long as they're throwing around 30 times, he's live to have a double-digit target game, which means there's upside, especially in the red zone if the team can get there. So he's still a top 20 option, although I think this is a gross game environment. Now for my wide receiver 19, and you might have been saying it, where the heck is Brandon Ayuk? Well, here he is. Look, the contract drama is finally over, and the deal with Brandon Ayuk, the reason I'm not a little bit higher on him is I am worried about the week 1 matchup against the New York Jets. Like, we know how good Ayuk is. He was dominant in man coverage last year, but he wasn't dominating man coverage every single week against this guy in Sauce Gardner, who is arguably the best cornerback in the NFL as it stands right now today, and I think that's a little bit of a concern. You could also say maybe there's some rust since he hasn't been with the team in the preseason, practicing at all up until these last couple of days with Brock Purdy. So he's still a top 20 receiver for me, but I'm tempering expectations week 1 for Ayuk. And now for my final wide receiver in tier 3, it's my wide receiver 20, and that is Rashee Rice, who's playing on Thursday Night Football against the Ravens, so I won't spend too much time here, but he's had a lot of offseason questions, and now he has a matchup against the top 5 secondary in the Ravens, so there are concerns for sure. But at least for week 1, things are looking nice for Rashee Rice because Marquise Brown won't be playing. Xavier Worthy's a rookie making his debut against a stout Ravens secondary, so that's not great for him. We'll see how much he's involved. And Travis Kelce's going to have to go up against Kyle Hamilton, the Ravens safety, who's one of the best in the game in coverage, so that's also difficult. So you might see the vintage Kansas City Chiefs from last year. I say vintage, the ones from last year where they weren't able to throw downfield as much because of this matchup this week, and you see more checkdowns to Rashee Rice and a little bit more of the run game, so Rice is a top 20 option. My tier 4 at the wide receiver position starts off with my wide receiver 21, and it's going to be George Pickens against the Atlanta Falcons. Now we're going into year 3 for George Pickens after he put up 1,000 yards last year, very quietly, finally put up 1,000 yards, and now Deontay Johnson is gone. But here's my concern for George Pickens this week. He's going to go up against the Atlanta Falcons, who have A.J. Terrell, one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL, and we're really not sure if George Pickens is a number 1 alpha receiver, right? That's been Deontay Johnson in the past. Pickens has been this guy who makes the highlight reel catches on the outside. Can he win at the line of scrimmage against the top cornerback? I'm pretty skeptical, especially when we consider that, not a lot of connection right now with Russell Wilson since Wilson was banged up in camp. Just a 42-point game total in this one. Shouldn't be all that high scoring. The Steelers want to run the ball. So I'm a little bit sketched out by George Pickens, but the good news is he's the clear-cut number 1 receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers. You would hope that even in the worst-case scenario, he's pushing for like minimum 6 targets here. Next up, we're going to go over to my wide receiver 22 from the Saints, and that's Chris Olave against the Panthers this week. And look, this one could potentially get into a situation where it's maybe not a gross game, but one that we're not looking too much forward to by the second half of it. Because first off, both of these teams were pretty gross last year, and they could be gross this year. The Panthers were hoping for a little bit more out of, but the Saints didn't do much to change their team. Like, the only skill position player that they added in free agency was Cedric Wilson, and the draft they brought in a late round pick in Bub Memes. So really, the wide receivers, the running backs, none of these rooms are upgraded. The offensive line was atrocious last year, and as of right now, it's the 31st ranked unit according to PFF. The only reason why it's not dead last is because the New England Patriots offensive line, according to their own head coach a week before the season, might not even have their starting tackles and guards on the team. So that's how bad things are in New England right now. But if you're telling me that the personnel is not going to change, the offensive line, that Derek Carr needs to get protection. He does not do well when he's under pressure. That could be a potential downside for Chris Olave week in and week out. One saving grace could be the new offensive offensive coordinator Clint Kubiak, who comes over from the 49ers. He was their passing game coordinator last year. Maybe he takes something from San Francisco and Kyle Shanahan and gets the ball out quicker, gets his wide receivers over the middle of the field, yards after the catch, things like that for Olave, who his first 2 seasons have mostly just been a downfield option, but it's a little bit sketchy, I'll be honest with you, this week. Up next is my wide receiver 23 in tier 4, and it takes me to Michael Pittman, who will have a matchup against the Texans this week and potentially maybe be like a nice little bit of a higher scoring game. And here's the thing, the matchup against the Texans, it's honestly not that difficult. You're going to get home underdogs from the Colts, which means maybe they're incentivized to throw. Usually, historically, is a good spot for offenses when you're a home underdog. And the Texans, like I said, they have Derek Stingley Jr., an exciting cornerback who there's still some question marks around. If he has a big year this year, he'll be up there as one of the league's best. But outside of him, there's not a lot that worries me. And Michael Pittman works on the underneath, works in the intermediate. It leads to higher catch percentages, and he was the most targeted player from Anthony Richardson in their 2 games last year together. And speaking of Richardson, that will be the concern this year. Like, how good does Anthony Richardson look? We know for fantasy, he himself is probably going to be fine because of his rushing upside as long as he stays healthy. But will he consistently be good enough as a thrower to propel guys like Michael Pittman forward? I think I'm okay at least week 1 saying so based on the matchup, based on the fact that last year Michael Pittman, and really every year, he stayed consistently healthy. Last season, he ranked 9th in targets and 5th in receptions in the NFL. I think Shane Steichen entering year 2 is going to continue to use him heavily. My wide receiver 24, we are still in tier 4 here. We have 7 tiers, by the way, is going to be DJ Moore, who's going to get a start this week against the Tennessee Titans, and this is a good matchup. Before we get into the specifics of that matchup, we know what the Bears have. They have 3 wide receivers who are all very talented, but it looks pretty obvious based on the preseason. DJ Moore is never going to leave the field. Keenan Allen might start the year as the wide receiver 2 in 2 wide receiver sets, but the rookie top 10 pick, Rome Odunze, is coming for that job, and my guess is he takes it sooner than later. But in terms of DJ Moore, he's not leaving the field like we said, and he's going to face the Tennessee Titans, who have a middle-of-the-pack secondary entering the season. They do have talented players. Like, they ended up landing L'Jarius Sneed, but if you remember, L'Jarius Sneed finds a lot of his success in the slot. He can play on the outside for sure, don't get me wrong, but in the slot, which is where he'll probably face somebody like Keenan Allen in 3 wide receiver sets, and DJ Moore will get to avoid him a good amount. So Moore's a top 24 receiver right now for this week, but I wouldn't be shocked as the weeks go on if Rome Odunze starts catching up to him in the rankings. Now we get to my wide receiver 25, and it's Devonta Smith, who will play on Friday night against the Green Bay Packers, so I'll be a little bit quicker just in case you are already watching after that or like right before it. Anyways, he's going to have Kellen Moore, just like we talked about with A.J. Brown. Maybe you see a little bit more motion for Devonta Smith used in different ways. We know he's a highly efficient route runner already. One concern I would have is that he does get this more difficult, or at least improving, in a young Packers secondary and a young defense in general. And Jair Alexander, who finally seems healthy, might be matched up more against Devonta Smith if they try and motion A.J. Brown away from Alexander. And in general, like we mentioned earlier, Alexander is a somewhat smaller cornerback compared to, I shouldn't say somewhat smaller, he's a bigger cornerback, but at least compared to somebody like A.J. Brown, he would match up more nicely, in my opinion, against Devonta Smith. And that's what we've seen in this same matchup between these guys. We've seen him more so on Devonta Smith in the past between the Eagles and Packers. Time for my wide receiver 26, and it's a monster. It's a 230-pound size freak monster in DK Metcalf, who this week he's going to have a kind of a tougher matchup. Not the greatest spot against the Denver Broncos, and more importantly, against Patrick Surtain, one of the game's best cornerbacks in the entire league. So the overall Denver Broncos defense, I'm not too concerned about. I think it's a middle of the pack secondary, but Surtain for sure is good. Surtain for sure is a bigger cornerback at 6'2", 208 pounds, as big as it's going to get, which is going to be important, and I think he's going to be on DK Metcalf for a lot of this game, if not all of it. Now, the saving grace for DK Metcalf is he's just a cheat code monster. He earns red zone targets and deep targets at a high rate. That's great for fantasy football. And he has a new offensive coordinator in Ryan Grubb, who we've talked about plenty this offseason. Ryan Grubb wants to spread you out, go 3 wide receiver sets. That can help with a poor offensive line in Seattle, just spreading the defense out a little bit more. And that's where DK Metcalf can maybe earn some more upside because of more downfield targets in this game. Moving on to my wide receiver 27 as we remain in tier 4. The final guy in tier 4 for me, by the way, before we get into tier 5, and that's Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, who now with Jahan Dotson not there anymore, looks to be the clear cut. He already was the clear cut number 1, but really no other reliable options for the rookie Jaden Daniels, in my opinion, right now, week 1, outside of Terry McLaurin. And McLaurin is just very quietly a great consistent producer despite his quarterbacks. You could see last year, the last 3 years, 1,000 yards every year. You even go back an extra year, you're going to have 4 straight seasons of 1,000+ yards. And this year it should get better with Jaden Daniels under center and not Sam Howell, who was one of the most inaccurate and inefficient quarterbacks in the NFL last season. Now, I will say the matchup week 1 for Jaden Daniels on the ground with his legs, it'll be fine for him specifically, but the matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they're not the same stout defense like they once were in the past, but they still do have Jamel Dean and Antonio Winfield Jr., who are 2 of the best defensive backs in the entire division, conference, and maybe even the NFL. Definitely when we're talking about the safety Winfield Jr. So it could be a little bit of a tougher matchup for McLaurin. All right, tier 5 starts off with my wide receiver 28, and that's going to be T. Higgins against the New England Patriots this week. And there's a couple of things here that are nice. We talked about this with Jamar Chase. Outside of Christian Gonzalez, who has his own question marks entering year 2 off injury, there's not really a lot in the Patriots secondary that concerns me. And there just might might be overall more usage for T. Higgins this week, who when he's actually healthy and so is Joe Burrow, Higgins averages over 14 fantasy points per game. That's a top 20 production. Jamar Chase, as of this recording, hasn't signed his contract. Maybe you're already watching this and he has by now. Okay, then no worries. But if for some reason Chase doesn't play, obviously Higgins becomes much higher up in the rankings. But other than that, there's no more Tyler Boyd, which means the wide receiver 3 job is going to be between Jermaine Burton. And it seems like Andre Iosivas has ended up winning that job. So Iosivas, if he ends up winning it, it seems like that. I'm not too concerned about him being an immediate threat, at least week 1, compared to Tyler Boyd, who is earning these 90 to 100 target seasons week or yearly next to one T. Higgins. The target competition should be easier. And it also helps that Joe Burrow is finally entering a season healthy. I mean, my God, the dude's always hurt. He's fine now. Apparently, the rest is all good. My wide receiver 29, you can see at the bottom of the screen right here in our tier 5 is going to be Stefon Diggs. And I'm a little bit concerned for his matchup. He's now on the Texans against the Colts. And like I mentioned earlier, Kenny Moore is one of the best slot cornerbacks in the league. That's who Stefon Diggs could see a lot of in this game if he moves into the slot. But that's not a guarantee. And based on preseason usage, there's a good chance that we see more Tank Dell in the slot, or at least a little bit of a mixture of that. So both of these guys, I'm somewhat concerned about their week 1 matchup eating into each other's workloads week 1 compared to Nico Collins. But we should at least point out that Stefon Diggs is aging, coming off of a bad season, when Tank Dell is just coming off of an injury, but he was one of the most efficient receivers as a middle round rookie last year in the NFL. I think CJ Stroud will remember that. Now, before we get into wide receivers 30 to 40, who will help you decide all your flex options this week and beat your friends, smack them around, almost 70% of you are not subscribed to this channel. I get it. You never remember to subscribe. Nobody tells you to, but I want to tell you right here, because my goal is to get that number to as close to 50% as possible. The more of you that subscribe really helps my channel grow and helps me make more content. If you find this content helpful, here's my ask for you, gentleman's agreement, hit that subscribe button. Okay, we remain in tier 5 with my wide receiver 30. It's going to be Zay Flowers, the second-year player coming off of a solid rookie year where he had 800 yards, over 70 catches, almost 80 catches as a rookie. Now he'll enter year 2 without Odell Beckham Jr. and probably the number 1 receiver on this team. But the problem is he'll be playing on Thursday Night Football, so we'll be quick just in case that game's already over by the time you're watching this. He's going to be facing the Chiefs, who were number 2 in pass defense last year and still have a top 10 unit despite losing L'Jarius Sneed this offseason. Zay Flowers will also compete with guys like Mark Andrews and the rushing attack of the Ravens. So Todd Monken entering year 2, maybe they expand the Zay Flowers role to use him more downfield. Hopefully by the time you're watching this, or maybe it's already happened that game and we got a good roll out of Zay Flowers. Fingers crossed he had a great game, but right now he's my wide receiver 30. That takes me to my wide receiver 31, and it's Christian Kirk, who's coming off of a solid 2023 season where he put up good numbers despite playing next to Calvin Ridley, who's no longer there and leaves behind almost 140 targets in the Jaguars offense. Not only is Calvin Ridley gone, but so is Zay Jones. They replaced him with Gabe Davis, nothing really crazy there, and Brian Thomas Jr., a first-round pick out of LSU, who's an extremely talented player, and I think he can honestly, by the end of the year, be the number 1 receiver on this team. I'm not too concerned about that happening week 1, but what I'm concerned about for Christian Kirk is this matchup against the Miami Dolphins, one of the best secondaries in the NFL. You know the name Kendall or Jalen Ramsey. They end up adding Kendall Fuller. They add Jordan Poyer. Who knows what's left with him, but you know, it's a former Bill. He's been great for years now. They have Javon Holland as well, who had one of the highest PFF grades last season at safety. Tough unit, scary matchup for Kirk. Now we get to my wide receiver 32, and it's Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This is a guy who a lot of people said had a down year last year for fantasy, yeah, but overall 135 targets despite not being used in the slot as much, which he should have been. The reason he had a down year for fantasy, only scored 2 touchdowns. But that slot usage should come up under new offensive coordinator Liam Coleman, and that's what we've already seen in the preseason. And a nice matchup like we talked about earlier for Tampa Bay Bucks this week when we were talking about Mike Evans. They're going to face the Commanders, who don't have Kendall Fuller. They have to rely on guys like Michael Davis, a free agent signing who wasn't great for the Chargers last year, and a rookie in Mike Sanders still from the Michigan Wolverines. I think he was a second-round pick. So overall, this is not really a secondary that I'm concerned about. I think Chris Godwin gets into the slot more, maybe even finds the end zone week 1, bold take, and has a nice game. My final wide receiver in tier 5 is my wide receiver 33, and it's Deontay Johnson, who has a new home in Carolina now, and I think overall it's a pretty nice spot for him in week 1. And a lot of that interest comes from the fact that I think he's just going to see a high target share. Xavier Leggett's not fully ready to go. He might be rotated in week 1, their first-round rookie. Adam Thielen's now 34 years old. I think this is the Deontay Johnson year, and any single week this guy can finish as a top 10 receiver. He's that good. Now this week he'll have not the easiest matchup against the Saints secondary. That's probably a top half of the league unit, maybe could push as a top 10 unit, but their defensive line is not great, which means the Panthers, who invested in their offensive line this year, probably have a top 2 or top 3 most improved offensive line, should give Bryce Young, their second-year quarterback, more time to throw, which could help Deontay. Wide receiver 34 is Tank Dell, and you can see him like right around here by my face. And Tank Dell, look, we've kind of already talked about this whole situation between Tank Dell. Last year as a third-round pick out of Houston. He stays with the Houston Texans, and he has a great great year before an injury that ended his season. And we've gone in depth about how Nico Collins is the number one receiver on the outside. And at some point this year, my thought is that Tank Dell, the younger, more explosive player, will overtake Stefon Diggs. We just don't know if that's going to happen week one. That's why for this week, he's lower in the rankings. He might have to face Kenny Moore of the Colts in the slot more, which is a difficult slot cornerback. So in general, he's still a flex option for me. But if you're in a league where you have loaded running backs or receivers, he could be a guy that hits your bench. And by the way, Tank Dell is supposed to start off my tier 6 here as my wide receiver 34. I think I put him in tier 5 earlier, but let's get to now the next guy, my wide receiver 35, Keenan Allen, which is a similar situation to a Tank Dell. It's a loaded wide receiver room. The offense should be talented. And for Keenan Allen, he's just falling down my rankings. Didn't have the greatest preseason or camp. And I think the rookie Rome Odunze can push him immediately in week 1 for targets. There's a pretty good chance that in 3 wide receiver sets, which this team should be running a lot of, and maybe not a lot of, but a decent amount of, because most teams use heavy 3 wide receiver sets, it's going to be DJ Moore on the outside. And if Rome Odunze gets to the outside as a predominantly outside receiver in college, where he put up over 1,500 yards last year, that could spell bad news for Keenan Allen, who would have to go into the slot, which could be, maybe a decent role, but in terms of explosive plays of 20 plus yards and red zone usage, that could drop a little bit for this week. And the other piece of bad news for Keenan Allen, if that happens and he moved into the slot against the Titans, who don't have a great secondary overall, but they did sign the big free agent signing in L'Jarius Sneed from the Kansas City Chiefs. So this is a situation where if he had to face him in the slot and he's an aging receiver, Keenan Allen, who maybe had a bad camp, and it could spell bad news. Next up is my wide receiver 36. We stay in tier 6. The other side of that Bears game is the newcomer to Tennessee, Calvin Ridley. Also, I want to point out, I changed it. I put Zay Flowers. I think people have probably already commented so much. I put Zay Flowers in tier 5. I accidentally put Jordan Addison there when dragging him in. They kind of look similar from the little box of pictures I had, but there we go. We fixed that. Jordan Addison will be coming up in this video. He will be in it. So there's a little bit of a teaser for you where he'll land. But let's start with Calvin Ridley as my wide receiver 36. He signed the big 4-year, $92 million deal this offseason. He said, no, New England Patriots, I don't want to go to you. I want to go to somebody else, and surprise team, the Titans. Now, it does seem like DeAndre Hopkins, the veteran who suffered a knee injury in the offseason, is going to be ready, and he's going to play week 1, and he's already returned to practice. So I actually think there's a case to be made. DeAndre Hopkins is ranked very closely to Calvin Ridley for me, just outside my top 40, so he won't be in this video. But I think there's a case to be made that he's actually the number 1 receiver on this team after spending time on this team last year. But we'll see what happens. This team also invested in their offensive line. They have Will Levis. They gave him pieces, not only with Calvin Ridley, but rookie Tyler Boyd, or not rookie, wide receiver Tyler Boyd, but they added a rookie and JC Latham on the offensive line. So we'll see if the offense comes together. It's going to come down to Will Levis. Wide receiver 36 is Ridley. My wide receiver 37 plays on Thursday night, so it'll be quick. It's Xavier Worthy, who I think is a really talented player. Ran the fastest 40 time at the 4.21s. He put up production all 3 years in college. He's still just 21 years old, but he does have a tough intro matchup against a top 5 secondary with the Ravens. We'll see how they use him right out of the gate. I'm hoping for a big week because I have him in a lot of fantasy leagues, but I will say it's a tough spot, wide receiver 37 for week 1. As for my wide receiver 38, we finally get to the Green Bay Packers, who are going to be in a solid game in week 1 against the Eagles. So I haven't really talked about their receivers yet because I think they're all pretty similar between this range of like wide receiver 36 and wide receiver 50, all of these dudes. And we can start with Jayden Reed, my wide receiver 38 right here, who look, last year this Packers offense, the second half of the season, was top 5 in passing efficiency, and a big reason for that was Jayden Reed breaking out as a second round pick. But the reason it gets a little bit difficult for me to rank him higher is because I do think that these are going to be the starting receivers in 2 wide receiver sets when the Packers have 2 tight ends on the field and they're running the ball, which they'll do a decent amount of, Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. Then in 3 wide receiver sets, you'll see Jayden Reed, and at times you'll see Dontavian Wicks rotate in. So it's just kind of a snaps thing here. I also don't think that Jayden Reed's a red zone priority in this team compared to the tight ends, compared to even Dontavian Wicks, who was a nice red zone weapon last year, and these 2 guys right here who are going to start on the outside in 1. Romeo Doubs, who has great hands and has always been a red zone target for Jordan Love the past year or so, and also Christian Watson, who has the speed to win on those long developing routes across the field. And we can close things out with my tier 7 2 receivers, Jordan Addison, who's dealing with an injury, so he's lower in the ranks, but a really good matchup against the Giants as long as Sam Darnold can find some time, and also if all the attention's on Justin Jefferson, who should have a good game against that Giants poor secondary. Jordan Addison, less attention, might find a couple extra big plays. And the wide receiver 40, we just talked about the Packers. It's going to be Christian Watson. Their starting outside receiver has a lot of explosive plays, apparently looks healthy now in camp, and I think he's going to probably rival Romeo Doubs for the most snaps and routes run on this team in week 1 against an Eagles secondary that just lost James Bradberry for an extended amount of time and was one of the worst units in the NFL last year. They did add pieces this offseason, but we'll see if those guys are ready to go and all gelling together in week 1. So there you have it. These are my top 40 wide receiver rankings as of right now entering week 1. I'll be updating these all week long for every single position in the Fantasy Blueprint. We have a running back video that's already out. You can check that out. It'll pop up somewhere over here as well, so be sure to watch that running back video. These will all be updated. All the other positions and a whole lot more tools are in that Fantasy Blueprint, so be sure to get it linked down below. And hey, enjoy week 1, everybody. There'll be content going out the rest of the week, but I appreciate you. Enjoy the games. We finally made it. Best of luck, and I'll see you in the next one.